Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I am glad you could join me. Make sure that you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with your family and your friends. Now, if you haven't checked out the America's Founding series, I suggest you do. Last week, I talked about George Farragut, an American patriot, someone that came over here from the Spanish island of Minorca, and he is someone that really has a fascinating history. He really defines what America is all about. This week, I have another great episode lined up for the America's Founding series. I'm not going to tell you who the patriot I'm speaking about is, but you're not going to want to miss it. I could assure you, it's someone that very few people have heard about, and it's going to make for a great episode. Also, I have George Hill coming in on Wednesday. It's a really great discussion I have with him. We're talking a lot about what some of the stuff we're talking about today is going to be, but you're going to want to check that out. And there's a lot going on. We see the Trump administration has come in, they're shaking things up, they're trying to change the global economic structure the way it's been for the last 30 to 40 years. Obviously, it's a system that hasn't really been working out too well for us. We've seen adversaries gain. We've seen America's power and influence decline. We've seen individual Americans suffer because some of the policies on the global economic front. And this president's trying to change that. Now, when it comes to the tariffs, it's like having whiplash. One day tariffs on, the other day there's a pause in tariffs, markets up, markets down. A lot of people are questioning, does he have a plan? Is this just shooting from the cuff? Is this good? Is this healthy? The reality is that you have to shake some trees in order to understand that changing an entire system the way it's been for 40 years is not going to be easy. There's going to be speed bumps in the road. And a lot of people say, well, Trump dropped the tariffs because he saw what was going on in the bond market. And he saw that America's influence was shedding. Well, yeah, that may be part of it, but he's also someone that recalibrates. He remains flexible. Just because he says something doesn't mean he's going to stick to that policy. It's also because he saw that 70 nations did reach out to us, and that those 70 nations did say that they want to start negotiations. Now, America has been getting the short end of the stick for quite some time. And there was a reason that the way that trading takes place, all the trade imbalances that we see all over the world, the reason that we've allowed a lot of unfair deals in the past was we were living in a bipolar world. You know, after World War II, it was the United States and the Soviet Union, and there was a competition going on. And so we would negotiate, we would create deals with other countries that would give them some advantages to side with us, be an ally to the United States, or at least remain neutral and don't go to the Soviets. Well, the paradigm has shifted, right? The Soviet Union collapses throughout the 1980s, 1991, 92 being official, and it's a new world, yet the mindset doesn't really change. It hasn't really shifted. And we see that amongst American policymakers. Now, I just want every American, if President Trump could get countries to move 20, 30, 40, even 50% in our direction, give us 40 or 50% of what we're asking for. That's a huge win. I don't understand what the problem is with that. That is an enormous win. If we could blunt China's growing power and influence, that's a huge win. China is in a desperate economic situation. And finally, we have a president that is leveraging hard economic power, America's hard economic power, in order to advance our interests on the world stage, not the other way around. That too is a good thing, and it should be embraced. But for this episode, I'm not going to really focus on the economy. Economics is going to come into it, but there's something much bigger going on. You have a lot of war hawks that exist, and there's a lot of talk about Iran and Iran's nuclear program and whether or not the United States is going to be attacking Iran. Talks began on Saturday directly between the United States and the Iranian regime. This is the first time that official diplomatic talks between our two nations, face-to-face talks, have taken place since the Obama administration. And it appears that this administration is no nonsense. They want to give Iran one last chance to come to the table to strike a deal about their nuclear program, a serious agreement, not a delay tactic, not a stall tactic, but a serious agreement regarding their nuke program to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. And if the Iranian government is not serious, if Iran is just trying to use these talks as a delay tactic, if the talks fall apart, then there will be a military strike on Iran. It was George Hill who, a few weeks ago, when the whole signal debacle broke out, Mike Waltz bringing in the reporter, the Atlantic reporter, onto the signal chat, and then it being leaked to the rest of the world. Well, George was the first one that actually reached out to me, and he said, this whole thing's a haversack. And by haversack, he means a diversion, that this was almost intentionally leaked out. And the reason it was intentionally leaked out was to divert attention away from Iran. And what George pointed to was the fact that we have two carrier action groups. You have the Carl Vinson just about getting there. You have a major contingent component of the United States military in this region now. He also explained the C-17 traffic going into this area is enormous, and that we have the B-2 stealth bomber fleet stationed over at Diego Garcia. And he says, you're not going to do all this because of the Houthi rebels. You're not going to use America's premier B-2 stealth force to blow up a few Houthis. That's not the reason why. What George was explaining was how the United States government is putting the pieces together, strategically moving our military assets to coordinate a large-scale strike to destroy Iran's nuclear program. And that's what it's really about. And that's what I want to talk about in this episode, because I think that it's a really interesting question of what happens if we strike Iran, what may be the fallout, and what else is going on out there. Is there something that people aren't paying attention to? And I'm going to get to it all in this episode. If we look, the pieces are now falling into place on a strike on Iran's nuclear program. Iran has been beaten down in the last year. They have faced some really devastating losses. Iranian power and influence is much lower today than it was just a year ago or 2 years ago. The fact of the matter is you have Israel that decimated Hezbollah and Hamas, two groups aligned with Iran, work at the behest of Iran. These groups have been decimated. Leadership killed off, their operational capabilities extremely limited. When you look at Gaza, it's in shambles. When you look at what's going on in Lebanon, you have Hezbollah that's on the brink. Okay, they can't even trust pagers anymore after the Israeli operation. And then Israel launched a coordinated strike on Iran, taking out Iranian anti-aircraft weaponry, taking out Iranian air defense systems. That should have been the first sign right there, that Israel was clearing a pathway for a strike on Iran's nuclear program. That should have been the first signal, because what it did was it cleared the flight paths. Now you factor in the movement of American military assets into the region and the strategic nature to the carrier groups. When you look at the B-2 bombers over at Diego Garcia, and you could see President Trump is giving Iran one last chance to come to the table, negotiate, prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, or he will launch a strike. Here's the thing. Iran has a history of using talks to delay, constantly delay, talks fall apart. And we've seen this among several countries, one of them being a nuclear power, right? When you look at North Korea, you could go all the way back to 1993. They'd engage in talks, they'd get some economic aid, they'd get some food aid. Then all of a sudden the talks would break down, all sides retreat, no talks take place for several months. North Korea keeps on advancing with its nuclear program, and then talks get revived. So we've seen this game get played before. Unfortunately, you have too many foreign countries out there that has proven that the United States gets taken as fools on the world stage, that you keep negotiating even though you have no real intent to come to an agreement. And we should be aware of the tactics that are being used, but our policymakers suffer from a groupthink mentality that I'll talk more about in a few minutes. However, when it comes to Iran, they have a history of doing this. And it really is an interesting situation, considering I remember back in 2004, 2005, everyone was talking about Iran potentially getting a nuclear weapon, that they were 1 to 2 years away from getting a nuclear bomb. Here we are, 20 years later, and now we're like, okay, they're a couple of weeks away from getting a nuclear bomb. And I know a lot has taken place. You had the Sputnik virus that took place against their nuclear capabilities. You had some internal components on their nuclear facilities being sabotaged. You had Iranian nuclear scientists being assassinated. So I know certain things have happened that could delay it. But the reality is that when you look at intelligence, it's an art, not a science, number one. And intelligence, a lot of the times, is used for political propaganda. And that whole 1 to 2 years back in 2004, 2005 was political propaganda. See, the real intention, if Iraq went successful, was to turn our eyes toward Iran, maybe possibly doing a regime change of the Iranian government. Now, since Iraq didn't go our way, those plans were taken off the table. Obviously, Americans had no stomach for getting involved in another Middle Eastern war, especially with Iran, which, let's face it, it's a far more capable country than Iraq was and far more capable than the Taliban is and was. So those plans were quickly scrapped. But that doesn't mean that our policymakers said we're not looking at a targeted strike on Iran. And the policymakers, and not only the policymakers, the elected officials as well, they've been itching to conduct a regime change in Iran. They've been wanting to conduct a regime change in Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. It is not exclusive to just Republicans. It is both Democrats and Republicans that want this strike, and many of them are trying to push the administration towards that. So the question becomes, at what point does Trump make the decision? At what point do we know that the nuclear negotiations are not providing any type of fruit and the president makes the ultimate decision to strike Iran? And if we do make the decision to strike Iran, what is the thinking behind it? Obviously, it's to eradicate their nuclear program. But what do they think is the Iranian response going to be? And that's where things start to get a little tricky. When it comes to Iran, there is little doubt that Iran, the mullahs in Iran, are bad actors. They operate in bad faith. They have done so for the last several decades. But it's also, we have to recognize that the Iranian mullahs are backed up against the wall. Given what Israel has done to them, given the fact that they don't really have air defense capabilities, given the amount of power and influence they lost, particularly when Bashar al-Assad collapsed in Syria and Assad had to flee the country, Iranian influence has been waning throughout the region. Yeah, they have some rebel-backed groups, some terrorist organizations like the Houthis that are thorns in our side, but let's face it, the Houthis are an incompetent bunch. The reality is that they are not as well coordinated, well organized. I am much more fearful of groups like Al-Qaeda than I am of the Houthi rebels. While the Houthis can cause disruption, the reality is the Trump administration has no qualms about hitting the Houthi targets, and we have now left the foreign policy of the Biden administration of don't. The Biden administration, don't attack ships in the Red Sea, don't engage in terrorist activity, and these organizations just laughed at Biden and ignored him. Well, Trump is going to definitely take a different approach, especially with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth over there at the Pentagon. So now when we're looking at this, we see that the strike on Iran's nuclear capabilities may be taking, and when this administration determines that the negotiations aren't going anywhere, and the Iranian government is using this as a delay tactic, is going to be really critical, because I do not think that the Trump administration is going to waste a lot of time. So it would be smart of the mullahs in Iran to actually be serious in these talks if they want to prevent a strike. Now, let's say a strike does happen. That's the game changer. What happens after that? Is it something like we just go in, we blow up their nuclear facilities? The reality is that the United States is the stronger, more dominant military. It's not like the Iranian military can really compete with us. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the United States on any battlefield with the Iranian military will win, but we can't take that for granted. When we look at the Revolutionary Guard, when we look at Iran's military, that they are far more capable than Iraq's military was. They're far more capable than the Taliban was, and the Taliban is in power today, 24 years later, better armed and equipped than they were prior to 9/11. And so it's not that they can't present challenges for us. More importantly, if you look at the geographic location in the Persian Gulf, well, we know that the Iranian Navy, any type of attacks may lead to conflict in the Persian Gulf. We know that the Iranian Navy may try and shut down the Straits of Hormuz. Well, 30% of the world's oil supply flows out of the Persian Gulf. And obviously a war in this region is not going to be a good thing, particularly at a time where there is global economic uncertainty. So what would Iran's response be if we did attack their nuclear program? Would Iran just simply suck it up, realizing that the United States has the bigger, more dominant military, realizing that they can't possibly win a war with the United States, and so they're going to say, all right, we'll take it on the chin. We tried, we attempted to build out a nuclear program. We didn't succeed, but we're not going to go to war with the United States. Is that going to be the thinking behind the Iranian government in any response? And I don't think so. What I'm scared of and what worries me is that that's the thinking that may be going on in the White House. I'm starting to see a little bit of the 2003 Iraq war, that we're going to be greeted as liberators. That the United States, we have an overwhelming force, we quickly depose of Saddam Hussein, and the Iraqi people are going to turn around, they're going to love us, they're going to be able to build out a thriving democracy, and everything will just be sweet sailing from there. Obviously, we were wrong back in 2003. That wasn't the case. But because of the groupthink mentality of the powers that be, because of the groupthink mentality in the Bush White House, they didn't plan for any alternative scenarios. They didn't plan. They weren't able to adjust quickly on the battlefield because of a rising insurgency. And we were caught flat-footed. And it cost a lot of American soldiers coming back in flag-draped coffins. It cost tens of thousands of soldiers to be life-altering injuries. And it cost us 2 years in order to turn the tide against the insurgency. So what is the talk going on behind the scenes now? We need to hope and pray that they're not engaging in the groupthink mentality that Iran is just going to capitulate if we attack and destroy their nuclear program. We know that Iran does have ballistic missile capability. That's not a secret. They have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of missiles that they can fire off at American interest. The United States has bases throughout the Middle East. We have strategic interests throughout the Middle East. Iran has stated that any government, any foreign government that does help the United States will also face attack. But we also know that there are Iranian agents here in the United States, that there are Hezbollah members here in the United States, and it wouldn't surprise me if there are Houthi rebels that are here within the United States. Now, for the Iranian agents, some of them have been here for decades. Some of the Iranians and the Hezbollah members have been here for decades. I remember back in 2007, 2008, a Hezbollah ring was broken up. They were smuggling cigarettes from North Carolina to New York, selling them on the black market, and then sending the proceeds overseas to fund their terrorist operations over in Lebanon and Israel. Would those assets be activated in any type of attack on Iranian nuclear programs? Have the assets, the Hezbollah assets and the Iranian agents here in the United States, have they surveilled targets that they're going to strike if we strike Iran? That's not out of the realm of possibility. And if we are going to strike Iran, we have to be prepared that we may see attacks here at home on U.S. soil. We may see innocent Americans being targeted, and we should take that into consideration. But also, we should understand that this could lead to a wider Middle Eastern conflict. Now, again, I am not someone that is afraid of the Iranian military. We could easily destroy them. However, what we are witnessing is massive global instability, and we've been witnessing this instability for the last several years. Our withdrawal from Afghanistan is going to go down as the worst foreign policy decision that has ever been made in American history. When you look at Biden's decision, it's not the withdrawal that was the problem, it was how we withdrew. The fact that Biden announced that we were withdrawing, and within a week, the Taliban was able to recapture the entire country and is better armed and equipped than they were 20 years prior. The fact that we spent 20 years at war, and what do we have for show for it? At least we killed Osama bin Laden. We did hurt al-Qaeda's strategic capabilities. But the rest of the world took note, and they said America is a paper tiger. That if America could spend 20 years at war, and this is the end result, what are we so afraid of? And I will guarantee you that that's when Russia gave the green light to invade Ukraine. That's when Putin made his final decision, said, we could do this, we could get away with it, and there's going to be hardly any consequences. He understood that America had no will to get involved in another country militarily, that the American people were war weary, that we were tired. He understood that the morale was at an all-time low. And it wasn't just Putin over in Russia. The Iranians got more aggressive throughout the Middle East. We saw China and Xi Jinping get more aggressive, Maduro getting more aggressive in Venezuela. So the world took note of that. Now, what does that mean? How does that play into today and any type of potential strike on Iranian nuclear targets? Well, I want you to understand the instability that I'm focusing on. If a war breaks out in the Middle East, immediately it's going to affect oil supplies. You can't transport oil in the middle of a war in the Persian Gulf. It's going to limit how much oil could come out of that region. And when you cut 30% of the world's oil supply off that quickly, it is going to have a dramatic impact on a global economy that already isn't really sure what's going on, that is currently undergoing a change with Trump's new vision of how he wants this global economy to be structured. But the Iranians can give us problems, and we'd have to focus our attention on Iran. Well, that's where you have to pay attention. Our military is 1/3 below readiness levels. It's been that way since Biden decimated it several years ago. You had a bunch of troops getting discharged because they wouldn't take an experimental shot. You have an enormous amount of supplies and equipment that went over to the Ukraine. You had the supply chain shortages, the semiconductors, which are still in short supply. It's not like we could just increase manufacturing of some of the weapon grade systems that we use. Recruitment down across the board. It's starting to pick up, but those soldiers aren't going to be battlefield ready for another 6 months to a year. And so we could see challenges in the Middle East. But it's not just the Middle East. This has the potential to quickly spread beyond the borders of the Middle East. If war breaks out in the Middle East, you already have other actors, foreign actors, ready to get involved in other parts of the world. If we're looking at this as a strategic map, pay very close attention. You have the Middle East, where we're going to be involved in the Persian Gulf. But then you have to look at Turkey, one of the more powerful militaries in the world, one of the largest economies in the world. There are already reports that Erdogan is looking to seize parts of Syrian territory, is looking to invade Syria, take parts of its territory and declare it as its own, try and take on some of the Kurdish regions that exist to target them. So you see, when instability starts, it quickly spreads. Now, we've already witnessed instability in Eastern Europe, and we've been witnessing it for quite some time. I warned on several occasions on this podcast that when these conflicts do happen, instability tends to increase. Well, if Vladimir Putin sees us involved in a Middle Eastern war, he knows we're not going to be providing arms to Ukraine. We're going to have to supply our own troops, our own forces. You know, everyone thinks like America could do all these different things. Just think about how we were stretched thin in Iraq and Afghanistan. So Putin is going to take advantage of that. And I could guarantee you he's going to increase the attacks within Ukraine. He's going to get much more aggressive towards Ukraine because he doesn't necessarily have to fear an American response. He doesn't have to fear more American weaponry being used against his forces. But then you have to look at Venezuela, right in our own hemisphere. For the last year, Maduro has made no secret of his intention that he wants to seize land from Guyana, that he wants to take some of the oil-rich areas and declare it as Venezuelans' own territory. Well, does this give Maduro the chance to greenlight an operation to try and do just that? Now, I'm not fearful of the Maduro regime or the Venezuelan military. They're not a powerful military at all. But as we're distracted in the Middle East, well, who is going to take care of the Venezuelan threat? What is a country like Colombia going to do? What are other surrounding countries going to do? Would they see Maduro's encroachment on other territory as a threat, and would they get engaged in military conflict with Venezuela? These are all flashpoints that can happen. And then the big one is obviously over in East Asia. What does China do? As the United States and China are engaged in this tariff battle back and forth, understand the Chinese economy has not been doing well over the course of the last 2 years. The Chinese economy is suffering. China is not as strong as people think they are. Yes, they've built up a lot of power and influence over the last several decades. There is no doubt about it. They are certainly the closest competitor to the United States when it comes to power on the world stage. But the internal problems that China faces is enormous. They face a collapsing economic problem. Their construction industry has grinded to a halt. Youth unemployment is up dramatically. Over the last 30 years, you have 600 to 800 million Chinese people that went from the depths of poverty and into the middle class. I don't think they want to go back into the depths of poverty. You have a gender imbalance because of the stupid one-child policy that was in effect for what, 40-somewhat years? Okay, so now they have this massive gender imbalance going on. And the one thing China fears, I said this last week or the week before, the one thing China fears is not American tariffs. What China fears is its own people. Our tariffs are not going to bring down the communist regime. China's own people will bring it down. And as economic instability rises in China, as the economic situation gets worse, and as China decides that it's going to dig in its heels against the United States when it comes to these tariffs, and the factories begin to go cold, people begin to lose their jobs, well, then dissatisfaction amongst the people towards the communist regime is going to rise. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on Xi Jinping and the Communist Party to respond to that. And how do they respond? If they see uprisings, if they see the sentiments of the people are turning against them, well, are they going to crack down with sheer brutality, potentially exacerbating the situation? Or are they going to attempt to maybe instill a sense of nationalism, get the Chinese people to rally around the administration because of potential outside threats, foster that sense of nationalism, to rally the Chinese spirit? And that makes for an interesting case, because if China does do that, well, what's the best way for them to do that? What is the Chinese Communist Party, the government of China, going to do? More importantly, what is the decision Xi Jinping is going to make? And one of the areas that we have to look at is Taiwan. If America is involved in a war with Iran in the Middle East, and Putin ups the war in Ukraine, and Venezuela takes parts of Guyana, you have Turkey taking parts of Syria, the world's going to be very distracted, is it not? And that leaves China with an opening. One of their long-term strategic goals in the 100-year marathon from 1949 to 2049 has been to recapture the island of Taiwan and bring it back under mainland's rule. And what better way to instill nationalism than to do just that, knowing that the American military is distracted in the Middle East, knowing that our response capabilities are going to be limited. Would Xi Jinping launch an attack, recapturing the island of Taiwan, causing chaos throughout the Pacific? Because if they do that, well, that's going to send shockwaves throughout the world. Okay, you have Australia that is going to grow concerned, and they're going to have to provide them some response to that. And we have to go back to 2021, Australia in general, warning that within the next 5 years, Australia will be at war with China. They warned about that 5 years ago. What about the Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, South Korea? They recognize the threat that China poses. And so are they willing to sit back and do nothing if China begins to try and expand its influence militarily throughout the South China Seas after it recaptures Taiwan? And what's their response going to be? What are the countermeasures going to be? What are the defenses going to be? What about North Korea? What's North Korea going to do? Again, if the world's distracted with all this, well, now does North Korea see an opportunity to try and take over to South Korea? Create that unified Korean peninsula? So you see, from one action in the Middle East, one war that could be a spark and happen in the Middle East can have significant ramifications throughout the entire world. And these are the discussions that need to be taking place in the White House. We can't sit there and say that just because we have the dominant military that we're going to be able to go in, take out Iran's nuclear program, and it isn't going to lead to a wider spread conflict. Especially knowing that the global economy is in decline, that the global economy is undergoing a transformation. As economies decline, wars begin. We know that. It's not a secret. History has been our guide for over 2,000 years. There are a lot of moving parts to this. And in this episode, just because I show what can happen, it doesn't mean it will happen. But that's the point of political science. That's the point of the levels of analysis in international relations. We look at the ingredients that exist. We look at the evidence, and then we try and predict what can happen. And as someone who is naturally a curious person, as someone that understands the level analysis, I am someone that always believes that you look at the worst case scenario, that you always plan for the worst. It's the emergency management in me. Blame Steve Kerr for that. You plan for the worst and you hope for the best. But the question is, do American policymakers do that anymore? Or do we plan for the best and never, ever think about alternatives if the worst begins to unfold? The world is in a very precarious situation right now. And watching these nuclear negotiations, watching the talks between the United States under the Trump administration and the Iranian mullahs, it's a different ballgame. The mullahs are on notice. They know that Trump is a different animal, that they can't screw with him. They know that he would authorize a strike in a heartbeat if he feels it's necessary. And so have the mullahs, are they playing it safe? Are they going to take the smart way out, engage in fruitful discussions, and ultimately come to an agreement? Or are they so blind that they don't care who the president of the United States is, that they think they could just delay? It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out on the world stage. But we need to pay attention to this, because this has the potential of being a major flashpoint in the world. And we can't lose sight of how sideways it could go and how quickly it can go sideways. So I hope you found the content of this episode informative. If you did, please leave the P.A.S. report a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Take 30 seconds to write a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Make sure you tune in to Wednesday's episode with George Hill. It's going to be a great conversation. And if you haven't checked out the America's Founding series, I suggest you do. It's a series that you are going to enjoy, so make sure you check it out. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back on Wednesday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at PAS Report.